of Palestinian grassroots organizations all over the world. In short, a Palestinian style that invigorates and informs all aspects of this far-flung community's existence. The main thing about it, to say again, is that it is quite irreversible and is fully an organic part of the universal debate on human rights, injustice, and the narrative of human freedom. Moreover, it is situated in contemporary awareness in all sorts of interesting and noteworthy ways. The habit of considering everything about Palestinian identity as at bottom being anti-Israel and only anti-Israel does an extreme disservice to the richness of the achievement I've been discussing here. As Rashid Khaldi has pointed out in his book, Palestine and the Palestinians, there was a coherent Palestinian national life well before the onset of Zionism, which despite the crisis of 1948 and the years of dispossession has never really been broken. Moreover, the universality of the drive for Palestinian self-determination has acquired an unbudgeable place in the world's agenda for liberation, peace, sustainability, and resistance. And as I mentioned, so many of the demonstrations of last week against the impending war in Iraq stressed free Palestine as part of their agenda. Every major United Nations conference for the past 2 decades, whether concerning the place of women, the environment, racism, human rights, disarmament, health, and human development, has had an important place in it for the question of Palestine. Paradoxical though it may seem, the Davos meetings in Switzerland for governmental and corporate leaders had an important component of its agenda devoted to Palestine. While at the other end of the world, in Porto Alegre in Brazil, the anti-globalization meetings featured the presence there of a large Palestinian contingent whose attendance assured an additional progressive dimension to the debates there. Any discussion of Middle East peace, including peace in Iraq, turns out inevitably to take us back to the question of Palestine. If in the period after 1948, as part of the post-war re-emergence of Europe, Israel had the status of a progressive cause, it is now Palestine that is the progressive cause. One need only think of the support one need only think of the support Israel had in the post-war period from such people as Sartre and de Beauvoir to judge how far from that position it has today fallen. As some of its homegrown critics like Amos Elon and Avishai Margalit have noted sadly, that since the first Intifada of 1987, Israel has been transformed dramatically into a symbol of oppression and injustice, lumped together with the United States for its imperial arrogance, its supremacist attitudes, and for its inhumane policies towards the Palestinians over which it has ruled for so long. Divestment campaigns, reminiscent of the anti-apartheid movement of the 70s and 80s, are now an important item on American campuses. And in Europe, numerous academics and intellectuals, artists and writers discuss boycotts of Israel that were unthinkable a mere 20 years ago. Problematic and humanly a very compelling issue, the challenge posed to conscience and consciousness by the Palestinian people raises a whole raft of questions about the post-Cold War political order that are quite unique in their density and difficulty. Contentious and noisy though some of these may be, I want to bring this lecture to a close by looking at 3 of them as dispassionately as I can. I won't minimize my partisanship at all, but I also won't let it get in the way of us universalizing an appreciation of the issues as I can. If it is true, as I firmly believe, that the cause of Palestine and of Palestinian human rights in particular is one of the great idealizing symbols of our time, it is just as true that its bristling complexity is partly what makes it so. There are at least 3 very difficult, very thorny problems that I want to look at now, not from the viewpoint of a policy expert, which I'm not, offering solutions and pragmatic answers, but rather from the perspective that I can bring, that of a humanist and intellectual who is profoundly engaged in the matter, but who is independent, and I would like to think as free as it's practically possible to be of doctrinal or ideological blinkers. Take the matter of victimhood as a start. For a Palestinian like myself, who has had the most fortunate and the most luxurious of lives compared with the overwhelming number of my refugee compatriots, or those who have had to live under Israeli rule for decades and decades, it is still difficult for me to minimize how much more Palestinians have been sinned against than as a whole they have sinned, how much they have suffered terribly in an unacknowledged silence even today. As of this moment, not a single major Israeli political or intellectual figure has articulated any serious regret or contrition, to say nothing of accepting responsibility for the disasters and sustained human suffering of the Palestinian people. I know nothing at all like it in contemporary history, nothing at all quite like this amazing stone wall of obduracy and denial. And yet, I must also say that the legacy of persecution, genocide, and anti-Semitism that is so much a part of Israel's history is a background to be figured in and contended with by Palestinians just the same. Two communities of suffering, I've called them. But one must, I think, make clear that at the present time, only one community has the tremendous balance of power in its favor. The other is, so to speak, the victim of the former victim. Israeli policies, as well as the meditations of many Western liberals who feel a collective guilt for Christian and European anti-Semitism, nevertheless, must be able to disentangle the past from the present, to make very clear distinctions between respecting the appalling past injustices heaped on Jews historically on the one hand, and on the other, simply excusing what the state of the Jews has done to the entire Palestinian people ever since. There is simply no earthly or divine dispensation that would excuse a state or a people for wreaking havoc upon another while pleading the travails of its own past as an excuse. Sharon's ideas are at least clear in that he believes, like George Bush, that his people owns the land and the world for historical biblical reasons, and that in making every effort to appropriate all of it at present and retrospectively, Israel is neither bound nor restrained by ordinary conventions of proper justice and proportionality. And there are many Israelis, individuals and NGOs, groups, associations that have tried to fight this. My argument here has been to say that such claims of unrestrained behavior, as Sharon says, we can do anything we like, nobody's entitled to criticize us. My argument has been to say that such claims do not at all correspond with universalism or the idea that human rights cannot be manipulated to accommodate what is a record of patent brutality and cruelty. Palestinians have been displaced, they have had their society shattered, they have had to live under military occupation, their lands and lives today are systematically torn apart. There are no two ways about it, I believe, which is not to say that we must simply overlook the tragic history of the Jews. On the contrary, I would always want to say that as a Palestinian, I should make my case to defenders of Israel on the basis of and taking full account of and making due acknowledgement of the history of discrimination against Jews. That kind of policy should never, ever be visited on anyone for any reason at all, least of all by Jews in the name of their safety and independence. The second problem is the one concerning the clash between two different peoples, two different cultures. Cultures, peoples, and civilizations are not watertight, inert, unchanging things. Exactly the opposite is true. And if there is such a thing as culture or nationhood at all, it is that each is and always will be enmeshed, constantly interacting and intertwined with other cultures and nations. Allowing for differences in kind, countries and peoples cannot really be separate and stand apart from their environment. It was historically one of the failures of British imperialism